Hey there, welcome to Shadow Archives. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy true horror and unsettling stories. This story goes back to the late 70s, a time that feels like a completely different world compared to how we live today. It was an era before cell phones, before rideshare apps, and before the general sense of paranoia that keeps us all constantly looking over our shoulders. My uncle was a young man back then, full of ambition and drive, studying medicine at the University of Chicago. If you know anything about medical school, you know it is grueling. It demands every ounce of your energy, your time, and your mental focus. My uncle was in the thick of it, spending long days and even longer nights in the library and the lecture halls, trying to absorb enough information to eventually save lives. He was living in Lincoln Park on the north side of the city, which was a bit of a trek from the university campus, but he made it work. Like most students, he was constantly tired and, more importantly, he was constantly broke. Every dollar had to be accounted for, and luxuries were few and far between. It was a crisp day, typical of Chicago weather where the wind cuts right through your jacket. My uncle had just finished a long morning class that had left him mentally drained. He walked out of the building, his heavy bag of medical textbooks slung over his shoulder, and looked at the busy street. He just wanted to get home, take his shoes off, and collapse for a few hours. He checked his pockets and did a quick mental calculation. He had enough money for a taxi, but barely. If he took a cab all the way back to Lincoln Park, it would eat up a significant chunk of his budget for the week. He stood there on the sidewalk, weighing his options. He could wait for public transport, which would take forever, or he could do what so many young people did in the 70s without a second thought. He could hitchhike. It seems crazy to us now, knowing what we know about the dangers of getting into cars with strangers, but back then it was a common way to get around. It was a social norm, a way for people to help each other out. You stick your thumb out, someone stops, you chat for a bit, and you get to your destination for free. It was simple. So he decided to save the fare. He walked to a spot where the traffic was flowing but slow enough for cars to pull over, and he stuck his thumb out. He stood there for a few minutes watching the cars rush by, wondering if he had made the right choice, or if he should just suck it up and pay for the cab. The wind was picking up, blowing off Lake Michigan, and he shivered, pulling his coat tighter around himself. Just as he was starting to regret his decision, a car slowed down and pulled up to the curb right next to him. It was a Plymouth Satellite, a solid, decent-looking car. It wasn't flashy, but it wasn't a junker either. It looked like the kind of car a family man or a contractor would drive. My uncle leaned down to look through the passenger window. The driver rolled the window down and leaned across the seat. He was a heavy-set man, looking completely normal and respectable. He had a friendly face, the kind of face you might see at a hardware store or a neighborhood barbecue. He smiled at my uncle, a warm, inviting smile that immediately put my uncle at ease. He seemed lighthearted, even jovial. He asked my uncle where he was headed, his voice calm and pleasant. My uncle told him he needed to get to Lincoln Park on the north side. The man nodded and said that was no problem at all. He was heading that way himself and would be happy to give him a lift. My uncle felt a wave of relief. He wouldn't have to stand in the cold anymore, and he wouldn't have to spend his precious money. He opened the door, threw his heavy bag onto the floorboard, and climbed into the passenger seat. As he settled in and closed the door, the car pulled back into traffic. The interior of the car was clean and smelled faintly of cologne and old upholstery. My uncle relaxed, grateful for the warmth of the heater. They started making small talk, the usual pleasantries exchanged between strangers. The man asked him about school, about what he was studying. My uncle, proud of his path, talked about medicine and the stress of his classes. The driver listened intently, nodding at the right times, seeming genuinely interested in this young student's life. He came across as a nice guy, maybe a bit chatty, but harmless. My uncle let his guard down completely. He looked out the window, watching the city pass by, thinking about the nap he was going to take when he finally got home. They drove for a while, navigating the city streets toward the highway. The plan was to get on Lakeshore Drive and head north, a straight shot along the water up to Lincoln Park. It was a route my uncle knew like the back of his hand. He had traveled it countless times. As they merged onto Lakeshore Drive, the conversation lulled a bit. My uncle watched the lake, the gray waves chopping against the concrete barriers. The rhythm of the car and the warmth were making him sleepy. But then something clicked in his brain. He realized that the view out the window wasn't matching up with where they should be going. The landmarks were wrong. The lake should have been on his right if they were heading north, but the orientation felt off. He sat up a little straighter and looked at the road signs flashing by. They weren't heading north. They were heading south. The man had driven onto the highway and immediately turned in the opposite direction of Lincoln Park. They were heading toward the south side, away from the university, away from my uncle's apartment, and away from safety. My uncle felt a sudden spike of confusion. He assumed it was an honest mistake. Maybe the guy got turned around or missed the exit ramp. It happened to the best of us, especially in a city with roads as complex as Chicago. He cleared his throat and turned to the driver, keeping his voice light and polite. He pointed out that they were going the wrong way and that he needed to head north. He expected the man to say, "Oh, shoot," and look for the next exit to turn around. But the man didn't apologize. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even tap the brakes. Instead, the atmosphere in the car changed instantly. It was as if the temperature had dropped 20 degrees inside that vehicle. The friendly, jovial demeanor evaporated like it had never existed. The man took his right hand off the steering wheel. He reached over and placed his heavy hand firmly on my uncle's knee. It wasn't a comforting pat. It was a grip. It was possessive and dominant. The man turned his head slowly to look at my uncle. The warm smile was gone, replaced by a dark, flat expression that made my uncle's blood run cold. His eyes, which had seemed so kind just minutes ago, were now dead and empty. He looked right into my uncle's soul and said, calmly but with absolute authority, "No, son, you are coming with me." My uncle froze. It was a primal reaction, the deer in the headlights. His brain struggled to process the shift. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a confused driver. This was an abduction. The man turned back to the road, a dark, self-satisfied smile playing on his lips, keeping his hand clamped on my uncle's knee. Panic exploded in my uncle's chest. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought the man might hear it. He looked out the window. They were speeding along the highway, the concrete median blurring past. Jumping out at this speed would be suicide. He was trapped in a metal box with a predator. Thoughts raced through his mind. Who was this guy? Where was he taking him? What was he going to do? The man's grip on his knee tightened, a silent reminder that he was in control. My uncle knew he had to do something, but he didn't know what. He tried to control his breathing, trying not to show the man how terrified he was. He looked at the door lock. It was the old-fashioned kind, a little plunger you had to pull up. He looked at the handle. He calculated the odds. If he tried to open the door, the man might grab him or the car might spin out. But if he stayed in the car, he knew with a terrifying certainty that he would never make it home. He stared at the road ahead, praying for a miracle, praying for a red light, a stop sign, anything to slow them down. They were approaching the South Shore area, and the traffic began to thicken. It was the middle of the day, and for some reason, the highway was getting congested. The brake lights of the cars ahead flared red. The man in the driver's seat grunted in annoyance and had to slow the Plymouth down. The speedometer dropped. 60 miles per hour, 40, 20. They were crawling now, bumper to bumper with the other cars. This was it. This was the only chance he was going to get. My uncle didn't hesitate. He didn't think about his heavy bag of books on the floor. He didn't think about his coat. He didn't look at the man. In one fluid, desperate motion, he ripped his knee away from the man's grip, reached for the lock, pulled it up, and yanked the door handle. The door clicked and swung open. The cold air rushed into the car, sharp and biting. My uncle threw himself out of the moving vehicle, tumbling onto the pavement. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the scrapes and the shock. He didn't look back. He didn't check to see if the man was coming after him. He just ran. He ran across the lanes of traffic, dodging honking cars, his heart pumping pure adrenaline. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs felt like jelly. He found a public phone booth blocks away, shaking so hard he could barely hold the receiver, and called a friend to come pick him up. He never went back for his books. He never reported it to the police. In those days, he figured, what was the point? It was just a weirdo who tried to scare him. He was alive, he was safe, and he just wanted to forget it ever happened. He buried the memory, chalking it up to a close call with a creep, and went on with his life. Life moved on. My uncle finished his semester, continued his studies, and tried to put that terrifying afternoon behind him. He stopped hitchhiking completely, obviously, and worked extra shifts so he could afford transportation. A year or two went by. It was now a cold December day, much like the one when he had been picked up. My uncle had met a wonderful woman by then, my future aunt. They were sitting in a cozy little cafe, enjoying the warmth and the smell of roasted coffee beans. It was a day, a happy moment. They were laughing, talking about their future, completely safe and content. There was a television set mounted in the corner of the cafe, playing the local news on mute. My uncle happened to glance up at the screen while taking a sip of his coffee. He froze. The cup halted halfway to his mouth. On the screen was a face recognized him instantly. It was a face that had haunted his nightmares for months after the incident, a face he had tried so hard to forget. It was the heavy-set man, the friendly face, the man from the Plymouth satellite. The news anchor was speaking solemnly, and the headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. My uncle couldn't hear the sound, so he frantically motioned for the waitress to turn up the volume. The audio filled the small cafe, cutting through the chatter of the other patrons. The man on the screen had just been arrested. His name was John Wayne Gacy. The reporter was detailing the horrors that had been discovered at his home. They were talking about a crawl space. They were talking about bodies. The police suspect him of raping and killing over 30 young men and boys. My uncle felt the blood drain from his face. His hands started to shake uncontrollably, rattling the coffee cup against the saucer. He felt sick. He wasn't just looking at a creep who had tried to kidnap him. He was looking at one of the most prolific serial killers in our American history. He sat there paralyzed, listening to the details of how Gacy operated. He learned that Gacy often picked up hitchhikers or young men looking for work. He uses his charm, his normal guy persona, to lure them into his car. Then the reporter mentioned a specific detail that made my uncle's heart stop completely. The police investigation revealed that Gacy had a specific method for ensuring his victims couldn't escape his car once he had them inside. On the passenger side of his vehicle, he had removed the inner door handle. He had modified the lock mechanism so that from the inside, the door was smooth. There was nothing to grab, nothing to pull. Once the door was closed, the passenger was trapped, sealed in like a tomb. My uncle stared at the screen, his mind racing back to that day on Lakeshore Drive. He remembered the click of the lock. He remembers the handle turning in his hand. He remembered the door swinging open. For some reason, on that specific day, in that specific car, the handle had been there. Maybe Gacy had used a different car that day. Maybe he hadn't gotten around to removing the handle on that specific vehicle yet. Maybe the mechanism had been jammed and my uncle's desperate strength broke it free. Or maybe, just maybe, it was some kind of divine intervention. He realized with a terrifying clarity how close he had come to being one of the faces flashed on the news alongside the killer. He had been in the trap. The monster had touched his knee and told him his fate. If that door handle had been missing, if the lock had stuck, my uncle would have just been another missing person on a poster, another body in the crawl space. He looked at my aunt, unable to speak, unable to articulate the horror washing over him. He had escaped a monster not because of skill or bravery, but because of a simple, functioning door handle. The realization changed him. He never looked at strangers the same way again. And every time he heard the name John Wayne Gacy, he didn't just think of the headlines. He felt the phantom pressure of a heavy hand on his knee and heard the cold, dead voice saying, "You are coming with me." It was just another scorching afternoon in the high desert when I decided to make the drive from 29 Palms, California, all the way to Albuquerque, New Mexico. At the time, I was stationed at the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center, a place that feels like the absolute middle of nowhere. 29 Palms is located in a desolate, sun-baked stretch of the Mojave Desert east of Los Angeles. It is a harsh landscape of brown dirt, jagged rocks, and unrelenting heat, a place where the horizon seems to stretch on forever into a shimmering haze. I had done the drive to the interstate many times, but on this particular day, I was feeling adventurous. I wanted to shave some time off the trip, and more than that, I wanted to win a bet. My friends had dared me to take the shortcut, a lonely two-lane strip of asphalt that cuts through the heart of the void. This shortcut wasn't just any back road. It was a path through total nothingness, a route that barely registered on some maps. The only landmark of any significance along the way was the town of Amboy. Calling Amboy a town is generous. It is really just a ghost town, a relic of a bygone era on Route 66. It sits in a vast basin that is nearly as far below sea level as Death Valley, giving the air a heavy, oppressive quality. To make the place even more unsettling, it is flanked by a dormant volcano and a massive black lava field on one side, and a blinding white salt flat on the other. It is a place of extremes, visually striking but deeply unwelcoming. At the time, around the local bars and barracks, Amboy had a sinister reputation. Rumors swirled constantly about it being a hotspot for satanic group activity, cult gatherings, and strange rituals conducted under the cover of the desert night. Whether those stories were true or just urban legends to scare the troops, they added a layer of unease to the location. I was driving by myself that afternoon. The sun was high and bright, bleaching the colors out of the landscape. My car hummed along the empty pavement, the only sound for miles. I didn't see another soul, no other cars, no trucks, not even a stray coyote. When I finally rolled into Amboy, the silence was deafening. The famous Roy's Motel and Cafe sign stood tall against the blue sky, a mid-century modern skeleton watching over the decay. I decided to stop for a brief moment. I pulled my car onto the gravel shoulder, the tires crunching loudly in the quiet. I grabbed my camera and stepped out into the dry heat. It hit me like a physical wall. I snapped a quick picture of the city sign, just to prove to my friends that I had actually done it, that I had braved the route they dared me to take. I looked around, scanning the abandoned buildings and the vast emptiness. There was a strange energy there, a feeling of being watched by the windows of empty structures. I didn't want to linger. I got back in my car, locked the door, and pulled back onto the road, eager to put Amboy in my rear view mirror. Leaving the salt flats behind, the road began to change. I proceeded to drive towards the mountain range that sits as a barrier between Amboy and Interstate 40 to the north. The car labored slightly as the elevation began to climb. The stark, open desert floor gave way to a more rugged terrain. I wound my way up the incline, the engine droning steadily. When I finally crested the top of the pass, the landscape shifted again. I was now driving north through a canyon. The walls of the canyon weren't steep rock faces, but rather rolling hills covered in high, dry grass. The grass was tall, seemingly waist-high or more, growing right up to the edge of the asphalt on both sides of the road. It created a tunnel effect, limiting my peripheral vision and making the road feel narrower and more claustrophobic. I was cruising along, enjoying the solitude and the feeling of making good time, when I saw something up ahead. In the distance, breaks in the heat waves revealed shapes in the middle of the road. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. As I got closer, the shapes resolved into a coherent, albeit confusing scene. I took my foot off the gas and began to slow down, my brain trying to process the anomaly in front of me. Blocking the road was a car. It wasn't just parked, it was positioned sideways, deliberately blocking both the northbound and southbound lanes. It was a bright red Pontiac Fiero, a splash of unnatural color against the muted tones of the desert. I brought my car to a crawling speed as I approached the scene. The details became sharper, and with each detail, a knot of dread tightened in my stomach. The Fiero was stopped dead center. Lying on the pavement near the car was a suitcase flung wide open. Clothes were scattered everywhere, strewn across the asphalt, as if an explosion had gone off inside a wardrobe. Shirts, pants, and undergarments lay motionless in the hot sun. But the clothes weren't the most disturbing part. Lying amidst the scattered laundry were two bodies. There was a man and a woman, both lying face down in the road. They were motionless, positioned splayed out as if they had been thrown from the vehicle or had collapsed while trying to flee. I stopped my car about 100 feet away from the wreckage. The engine idled quietly, but inside the cabin the atmosphere had changed instantly. The silence of the canyon felt heavy and threatening. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the scene. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, a primal warning signal that something was terribly, terribly wrong. It wasn't just the accident, it was the vibe. I am a Marine. We are trained to assess situations, to look for threats, to trust our instincts. And my instincts were screaming at me. I reached under my seat and felt the cold steel of my 9mm pistol. I pulled it out, the weight of it familiar and comforting in my hand. With a quick, practiced motion, I chambered a round. The metallic clack-clack of the slide was loud in the quiet car. I held the weapon in my lap, my eyes scanning the scene ahead, looking for movement, for shadows, for anything that didn't fit. I analyzed what I was seeing. It looked too perfect. It looked like a scene from a movie set up by a prop department. The way the car was perfectly perpendicular to the road, blocking exactly enough space to make passing difficult. The way the suitcase was open just so, the clothes scattered to draw the eye. The way the bodies were lying face down, faces hidden, in positions that seemed theatrical. A question burned in my mind. Was this an ambush? Was I being paranoid? Maybe these people were genuinely hurt. Maybe they had been attacked and left for dead. Maybe they had a medical emergency. The moral part of me, the part that wants to help people, urged me to get out of the car. But the survivalist part of me, the Marine, slammed the door on that idea. Getting out of the car seemed unthinkable. It was the classic horror movie move. The mistake the victim makes right before the music swells and the axe falls. I looked at the high grass lining the road. It was tall enough to hide anything or anyone. The wind rippled through the dry stalks, creating waves of movement that made it impossible to see if anything was lurking just a few feet from the pavement. I knew I couldn't stay sitting there. If this was a trap, I was a sitting duck. If I turned around, I would have to make a three-point turn on a narrow road, exposing my broadside to whatever was out there. I decided I had to go forward. I scanned the road, analyzing the geometry of the obstacle. The red Fiero was small, low to the ground. The man was lying to the left, the woman to the right. There was a small gap. I traced a line in my mind. If I drove carefully, I could pass the guy in the road on his left side, swerve sharply to the right to avoid the woman, squeeze behind the trunk of the Fiero, and pop out on the other side. It would be tight. I would be mere inches from the bumper of the red car and the bodies on the ground, but it was doable. My heart was pounding against my ribs, a heavy, rhythmic thudding that echoed in my ears. I took a deep breath, gripping the pistol in one hand and the steering wheel in the other. I put the gun down on the passenger seat within easy reach. I dropped the transmission into first gear. I didn't want to crawl past them. I needed momentum. I punched the gas pedal. The car surged forward, the engine roaring. I focused entirely on the line I had planned. The scene rushed toward me. I approached the man's body. I steered hard to the left, my tires biting into the edge of the asphalt. I cleared him. I jerked the wheel back to the right, the car swaying. I saw the woman's form flash by my passenger window. I was right on top of them now. I saw the red paint of the Fiero's bumper fill my vision for a split second. I swerved again, threading the needle. Behind the car, I waited for the impact, the sound of metal on metal, or the sickening thump of running over a person, but it never came. I had cleared the gap. I was past them. I didn't stop immediately. I continued forward a couple of 100 feet, putting some distance between myself and the strange tableau. I let off the gas slightly, coasting, trying to get my breathing under control. My hands were shaking. I needed to assess if I had actually hit anything or if the car was damaged. I checked the dashboard. Everything was normal. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the adrenaline spike that was making my vision tunnel. Then I looked up into the rearview mirror. What I saw made my blood turn to ice. The two bodies, the man and the woman who had been lying face down, motionless in the dirt, were moving. They weren't injured. They weren't dead. They pushed themselves up off the asphalt, rising to their knees with a terrifying fluidity. They turned their heads to look at my retreating car, but that wasn't the worst part. As they stood up, the tall grass on both sides of the road suddenly came alive. From the canyon walls, from the ditches, from the swaying stalks of dry grass, people emerged. It wasn't just one or two, it was a swarm. I watched in horror as at least 20 people stepped out onto the road. They appeared seemingly out of thin air, surrounding the red Fiero and the two decoys. They were dressed in drab clothing that blended with the desert, which explained why I hadn't seen them until they moved. They stood there in a pack, watching me. It was a coordinated unit. The bodies in the road were the bait, the car was the net, and the people in the grass were the hunters. At that moment, pure, unadulterated terror took over. Any thought of checking the car or slowing down vanished. My right foot smashed the gas pedal to the floorboard. The engine screamed as the RPMs redlined. I didn't care about the speed limit. I didn't care about the curves in the canyon road. I drove like a man possessed, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I kept checking the mirror, terrified that the red Fiero would spin around and come chasing after me, or that other cars would emerge from the side roads to cut me off. I didn't let up on the gas for miles. The canyon walls eventually fell away, and the landscape opened up again as I approached the interstate. I saw the green sign for I-40 East, and it looked like the gates of heaven. I only slowed down when I hit the on-ramp, merging into the flow of trucks and travelers. Seeing regular cars, semi-trucks, and families on vacation helped ground me, but the shaking didn't stop for a long time. I kept the speedometer pinned, putting as many miles as possible between myself and that canyon. I drove all the way to Albuquerque in a state of high alert, constantly checking my mirrors, jumping at every shadow. I will never know for sure what would have happened to me had I gotten out of that car. If I had stopped to check on the bodies, to offer help like a good Samaritan, I would have been surrounded instantly. 20 people against one, even with a pistol, are odds you don't survive. I don't know if they were a cult, a gang, or just a group of twisted individuals looking for a victim in the middle of nowhere. Somehow, I do not think the outcome would have been a robbery. The level of coordination, the theatricality of the bodies, the sheer number of people hiding in the grass. It suggested something far darker. I think about that day often. I think about how fragile the line is between a normal road trip and a nightmare. We watch horror movies and yell at the screen when the character goes into the dark basement or stops for the hitchhiker. We think we would be smarter. But when it happens in real life, under the bright sun, confused by what you are seeing, the temptation to act normal is incredibly strong. I am just thankful that my instincts were louder than my curiosity. Sometimes real life can be scarier than a movie because there is no script, and you never know when the credits are going to roll. It was one of those humid, electric nights that you only really experience in East Asia. I was traveling through Taiwan back when I was a bit younger, filled with that specific kind of wanderlust that makes you brave enough to explore but naive enough to miss the warning signs. I was spending the evening at a bustling night market, which is the heartbeat of Taiwanese culture. The air was thick with the smell of stinky tofu, grilled squid, and sweet bubble tea, and the noise was a chaotic symphony of scooters honking, vendors shouting out their prices, and the chatter of hundreds of people. It was sensory overload in the best way possible. However, after a few hours of walking through the dense crowds, I realized I needed to check in with back home. I hadn't sent an email to my parents or friends in a few days, and I wanted to let them know I was safe. I scanned the colorful neon-lit signs towering above the street stalls. Taiwan is a vertical place. Shops are stacked on top of each other in tall, narrow buildings. It didn't take long for me to spot a sign for a net cafe or internet cafe, located on the 6th floor of a building just off the main drag of the market. It seemed perfect. I could escape the heat, sit in some air conditioning, and fire off some quick emails before heading back to my hostel. I weaved through the crowd and found the entrance to the building. Unlike the bright, welcoming lights of the market, the entrance to this building was a dark, recessed hallway, squeezed between a noodle shop and a clothing stall. The building itself looked older, which isn't uncommon in Taiwan. The humidity and rain tend to age concrete quickly, leaving streaks of grime and peeling paint. It hadn't been well maintained, but it didn't look abandoned, just tired. I walked into the dark hallway, leaving the noise of the market behind me. The transition was abrupt. 1 second I was surrounded by life and noise, and the next I was in a quiet, dim corridor that smelled of damp concrete and old cigarettes. At the end of the hall was a small elevator. I pressed the call button, half expecting it not to work, but it lit up immediately. When the doors slid open, I was surprised. The interior of the elevator was uncharacteristically new compared to the rest of the dilapidated building. It had polished steel walls, a clean mirror, and bright LED lighting. It felt like a modern capsule inserted into a rotting skeleton. I stepped inside, grateful for the clean space, and looked at the button panel. In Chinese culture, and specifically in Taiwan, the number 4 is considered extremely unlucky. The pronunciation of the word 4 sounds almost identical to the word for death. Because of this, many buildings, especially older ones or hospitals, will omit the 4th floor entirely. It is a superstition that is taken very seriously, similar to how Western buildings sometimes skip the 13th floor, but with much more gravity. True to form, the buttons on the panel read 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6. There was no number 4. It went straight from the 3rd floor to the 5th. I verified the sign I had seen outside, which said the internet cafe was on the 6th floor, so I pressed the button for 6. The doors slid shut smoothly, sealing out the damp smell of the hallway, and the elevator lurched into action. It moved quietly, ascending with a soft hum. I stood there watching the numbers change on the digital display above the door. 1, 2, 3. The elevator continued to rise. I shifted my weight, getting my wallet ready to pay for the computer time. The elevator slowed down and came to a gentle stop. I assumed I had reached the 6th floor. The bell dinged and the doors began to slide open. I instinctively took a step forward, ready to walk into a room full of gamers and computer screens. But right before I crossed the threshold, I froze. My foot hovered in the air for a split second before I planted it back inside the elevator car. The sight outside the elevator stopped me dead in my tracks. Instead of a brightly lit internet cafe with rows of computers and the smell of instant noodles, I was staring into a void. The floor outside was pitch dark. It was an abyssal, heavy darkness that seemed to swallow the light coming from the elevator. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, illuminated only by the spill of the harsh white LED light from where I stood, I realized that the floor was completely abandoned. It looked like it hadn't been occupied for decades. The air that drifted in was stale and cold, smelling of dust and something metallic. There were random pieces of furniture scattered around the large open room. Old salon chairs, perhaps, or desks. But they were all draped in thick white cloths. They looked like ghostly mounds rising from the dusty floor. Because the building was small, each floor was a single occupancy unit, meaning the elevator opened directly into the room. From where I stood, I could see pretty much the entire floor, and it was a wasteland of shadows and neglect. Confusion washed over me. I thought I must have pressed the wrong button, or that the elevator had malfunctioned and taken me to a storage level. I quickly turned to look at the control panel inside the elevator to check which floor I was on. Strangely, there was no light indicating the floor number. The digital display above the door was blank, and none of the buttons on the panel were illuminated to show the current location. However, the button for the 6th floor, the one I had pressed, was still lit up, indicating that the command hadn't been fulfilled yet. I hadn't reached my destination. The elevator had stopped somewhere in between. All of this processing happened within a couple of seconds. I was standing there, confused, and starting to feel a creeping sense of unease, peering out into the silent, dark room. That is when I noticed the movement. In the distance, on the far side of the room, something shifted in the shadows. It was hard to see clearly at first, but as I focused, I could make out a figure. It looked like a person, but there was something wrong about the way they stood. They were dressed in some kind of loose, pale gown or smock that hung off their frame. The figure wasn't walking normally, it was moving slowly, almost gliding, heading directly toward the elevator. A cold wave of fear crashed over me. It wasn't just the surprise of seeing someone in an abandoned room. It was the primal instinct that tells you when you are in the presence of something predatory. I was thoroughly creeped out. I didn't want to ask for directions. I didn't want to know who that was. I just wanted to leave. I slammed my hand onto the close door button, pressing it repeatedly. "Come on, come on," I whispered, panic rising in my throat. The figure was getting closer, moving with a terrifying, silent deliberation. As soon as I pressed the button, the situation went from scary to terrifying. The overhead lights in the elevator flickered and then died completely. I was plunged into total darkness. I was trapped in a metal box. The door potentially still open to the abandoned floor, with that thing coming toward me. I am not ashamed to say that in that moment, I was this close to pissing my pants. The darkness felt heavy, like it was pressing against my skin. I held my breath, terrified that I would feel a cold hand grab my arm, or hear breathing right next to my ear. It is actually freaking me out just thinking back to it now, remembering that feeling of absolute vulnerability. For a second, that felt like an eternity. I stood in the blackness. Then, the lights flickered back on with a loud buzz. The doors, thankfully, were sliding shut. Through the narrowing gap, I caught one last glimpse of the white-draped furniture and the empty darkness before the steel doors sealed me in. The elevator jolted back to life with a shudder that rattled my teeth. It resumed its ascent. A few moments later, the bell dinged again, and the doors opened. This time, I was greeted by the bright fluorescent lights of the internet cafe. The sound of clicking keyboards, the murmur of voices, and the smell of cigarette smoke washed over me. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever experienced. I was beyond relieved. My knees felt weak, and my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I walked out of the elevator immediately, needing to get away from it. I found a computer station, sat down, and just stared at the screen for a minute, trying to regulate my breathing. I didn't even log in right away. I just needed to feel the reality of the people around me. After gathering my wits a bit and convincing myself I was safe, I realized I couldn't just keep this to myself. I walked over to the cashier's desk to pay and maybe ask a question. The girl working there looked bored, scrolling through her phone. I paid for my hour, and then, trying to sound casual, I told her what had just happened. I told her the elevator stopped on a dark floor below, and I saw someone down there. As I spoke, the boredom vanished from her face. She went pale, her face turning a bit ashen. She put her phone down and looked at me with wide eyes. I asked her, "Have you heard of anything like that happening before?" She hesitated, looking around to see if her boss was nearby, then leaned in closer. She told me that she had never experienced it herself, but she wasn't surprised. Apparently, some of her co-workers and occasional customers had brought it up over the years. She explained the layout of the building. The building has 6 floors. The ground floor is the lobby. The second and third are businesses. The 5th is storage, and the 6th is the net cafe. The 4th floor, the one that isn't on the buttons, had a history. She told me that years ago, the 4th floor used to be occupied. It was a hair salon, a pretty busy one. It operated normally for a long time until tragedy struck. One of the female employees, a young stylist, killed herself there. The rumors were murky about why she did it. Maybe a broken heart, maybe financial trouble. But the method was well known. She had stayed late one night after the shop closed, went to the hair washing area and slit her wrists over one of the ceramic basins. She bled out into the drain. She wasn't found until the next morning. The store tried to continue operations after the police cleared the scene. The owner cleaned everything up and reopened, but things started getting weird immediately. Customers would complain that when they were getting their hair rinsed, the water coming out of the nozzle looked red, tainted with blood. The stylists would check the pipes, but everything was clear. Then came the visual apparitions. Customers sitting in the salon chairs would look into the mirrors in front of them and see a figure standing behind them or walking away in the reflection. When they turned around, no one was there. The atmosphere on the floor became oppressive and cold. Naturally, the business couldn't survive with that kind of reputation. People stopped coming, the staff was too scared to work, and the salon closed down a few months later. The building owner was desperate to re-rent the place. In Taiwan, real estate is expensive, and having a whole floor empty is a huge loss. But news travels fast, and businesses here can be quite superstitious. No one wanted to rent the 4th floor after someone had died violently in it. It was considered unclean. The owner tried everything, eventually dropping the price to nearly nothing. Finally, a stationery supplies store owner, a man who didn't believe in ghosts, agreed to rent it. He got a great deal and started renovations to turn the old salon into a warehouse and shop for pens and paper. During the renovations, however, the activity escalated. It wasn't just spooky feelings anymore, it was physical. Tools would end up in strange places or disappear entirely. Oh, large mirror left over from the salon shattered into 1,000 pieces when no one was anywhere near it. The workers were already on edge, but the breaking point came with the elevator. One of the construction workers was moving supplies when the elevator doors suddenly closed on him. It wasn't a normal malfunction. The doors clamped down on his hand with crushing force and refused to open. His hand was badly jammed and broken. After that accident, the construction crew walked off the job and refused to return. The stationery store owner pulled out of the lease, and the building owner finally gave up. He shut down the floor completely to ensure no one would go there by accident and perhaps to trap whatever was inside. The building owner hired the elevator company to come in and modify the system. He had them replace the control panel to remove the number 4 button entirely. He had the elevator programmed to skip the 4th floor mechanically. It was a hard bypass. The girl behind the counter looked at me, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Let me repeat that," she said, making sure I understood the gravity of it. "The elevator is programmed to never go to the 4th floor. It doesn't even have a button for it. It physically shouldn't stop there." But she admitted that for some reason, the programming fails. Sometimes, usually at night, when people take the elevator alone, it overrides its own commands. It brings them to the floor that shouldn't exist. The doors open to the dark, abandoned salon with the covered furniture, and some people, like myself, see a figure walking around in the dark, wearing a salon smock, perhaps still waiting for a customer or just waiting for the elevator doors to open so she isn't so alone in the dark. I finished my time at the computer, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. When it was time to leave, I didn't take the elevator. I walked down 6 flights of stairs through the dark, humid stairwell, running past the door to the 4th floor without looking at it, and didn't stop until I was back in the noise and lights of the night market. I never went back to that building again. I've developed a strange habit over the past year, something I didn't even notice until a friend pointed it out. Whenever I walk into a room and shut the door behind me, I turn my head away from it and close my eyes until I hear the click of the lock. Only when the door is fully closed will I open them again. It doesn't matter if I'm in my office, my apartment, the bathroom, a friend's house. If the space behind me is closing, I refuse to watch the door shut. My friend teased me about it until I told him why. Then he never joked again. Everything started during a business trip my company sent me on. I work for a water seal manufacturer based in St. Paul. We make coatings for exposed wood, decks, boats, stuff like that. In most places, wood sealant is just another household product, but in the Ashland, Ecorse Falls, Ironton region, the very word sealant carries baggage. People associate it with the infamous Ethelor disaster that nearly wiped out the economy back in the 50s. Not all of us were involved in that mess, of course, but guilt lingers in an area whether or not you earned it. Anyway, I was sent to an industrial park outside Ecorse Falls to meet potential distributors. Business trip. Nothing special. I expected a boring 4 days, maybe some decent restaurants and a quiet hotel to sleep in. Instead, I checked into the Hotel Umbra. Calling it old-fashioned would be generous. It felt like stepping back into 1930. The wallpaper in the lobby had turned the color of nicotine and old paper. Dust covered everything, including the man behind the front desk, whose mannerisms reminded me of someone living half a second out of sync with time. He gave me a key, not a key card, an actual tarnished brass key, and told me I'd be on the 4th floor. The place had an ancient cable elevator with 2 sets of doors, a rattling metal accordion gate on the inside, and heavy sliding doors on the outside. It groaned with every inch upward. I closed the gate, latched it, and pressed the small black button for my floor. Just as the outer doors were almost shut, I caught sight of something, a young woman's face rushing toward the narrowing gap. She was too late. The doors closed, and the elevator lurched upward. I blinked, unsure what I'd seen. Maybe she was trying to catch the elevator. Maybe she lived on the same floor. I told myself it didn't matter. I only thought about it again when I returned to the elevator to bring up a bag I'd left in the car. The elevator doors slid almost shut when that same face appeared again, darting toward the gap between the doors, eyes staring at me through the metal gate. I snapped forward and pressed the door open button. The machinery clanged, reversed, and slid open. I waited. From the doorway, I could see down one direction of the hallway. Empty, no footsteps, no voices, no recently shut doors. Still holding the button, I slid the metal gate aside and leaned my head out to check the opposite direction. Nothing. She should have been there, or at least I should have heard her footsteps echoing down the corridor, but there was no sign of her. A small, cold feeling crept into my stomach. I returned inside the elevator, letting the doors move again. And this time I stood directly in front of the narrowing gap instead of leaning casually against the back wall. When the gap shrank to the width of a thin face, that's when it happened. Fingertips, then her face again, rushing toward the closing doors from somewhere out of view. She moved too fast, too silently, and with an expression I couldn't shake. She looked about 13, plain, pale skin, brown hair cut to her neck and a little dirty. Her eyes were dark, almost too dark, and filled with some desperate need. A look you'd expect from someone whispering, "Help me," through glass. The doors closed. The elevator descended. Later, passing the front desk, I mentioned seeing a young girl running around. I asked the old man if she had family staying there. "Heard the stories then?" he asked, rocking back slightly in his chair. I told him I hadn't heard anything. "That's our Maddie," he said. "Young Maddie's been here a long time. Takes a liking to gentlemen guests. Always been shy. Never says a word. Just curious. Likes to watch." I said there had been a girl following my elevator on every floor, waiting for the doors to almost shut before appearing. He nodded, unbothered. "That's Maddie. Sweet on you. She just wants to see. All she ever does. Curious little thing." I stayed 3 more nights at Hotel Umbra. I was supposed to stay 4, but I couldn't sleep in that building anymore. I tried my rental car instead. It didn't help. Let me explain. I started seeing her everywhere. Every time I closed a door in my room, I saw her face rush to the gap at the last possible second. Not just the bathroom door, not just the closet. She showed up wherever something closed. If I watched the gap, she would appear there, never lingering more than a split second, always retreating faster than my mind could fully process her presence. The bathroom was the worst. The first time I shut the bathroom door fully, I saw her face slide into view through the narrowing space. Eyes wide, blank, pleading, only to vanish when the door clicked. I threw it open again, nothing. No footsteps, no shadow, no sound. But the memory of those dark eyes stayed burned into mine. Another time I shut the closet. As the door nearly closed, her head leaned into view from inside the closet, studying me with that same desperate curiosity. I ripped the door open so fast it rebounded off the wall. Nothing, just clothes hanging and the stale smell of the old hotel. But the worst moment inside the room came when I sat at the writing desk provided for guests. I pulled the large bottom drawer open to search for paper, found nothing, and closed it. As the drawer slid shut, she rushed forward from inside the drawer, her face inches away through the narrowing gap, staring up at me with that blank desperation. I panicked. I pulled the drawer completely out of the desk and threw it onto the carpet. The crash echoed through the room. I didn't care. I spent the last night in the car, parked in the hotel lot. I thought she wouldn't follow me there. I was wrong. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt something near the car. When I opened my eyes again, I saw movement, her movement, ducking out of sight in the side view mirror, gliding behind a column, vanishing behind the hood. Once, when I opened my eyes too quickly, I saw her upside down at the top of the windshield, her face hanging over the glass as if she were crawling on the roof. I didn't sleep at all after that. I returned to St. Paul the next morning. I thought distance would fix the problem. Somehow I believed she was tied to the hotel, that she was a presence bound to that building, that hallway, that elevator. But young Maddie followed me home. Now I see her, wherever something can hide behind a closing gap. At work, when I shut a filing cabinet, I see her face retreating before the drawer seals. When I close the break room fridge, her eye appears and disappears. When I shut my trunk, her fingertips slip out of sight. It doesn't matter that the Hotel Umbra is 4 states away. She came with me. I've had to adapt. I avoid looking at doors as they shut. I avert my eyes and close them. I keep them shut when I close anything big enough for her to hide behind. Cabinets, drawers, the trunk of my car, closets. Not because I'm worried she'll hurt me, but because I know I'll see her. For a while, this method worked. I managed, in a way. My life stabilized into something like normal, until a few nights ago. I was getting ready for bed, flossing in front of my bathroom mirror. The door was shut. The cabinets were shut. Everything was closed. Nothing for her to slip behind. Or so I thought. I opened my mouth wide to reach my molars, stretching my jaw. And in the reflection of the mirror down the back of my throat, I swear I saw fingertips retreating. When I was a young boy, probably around 8 or 9 years old, I developed an intense and somewhat unusual fascination with the past. While other kids were obsessed with cartoons or action figures, everything that had to do with archaeology began to thrill me in a way I couldn't quite explain. My mother, being a supportive parent who wanted to encourage my reading habits, would often take me to the local public library. The stated purpose of these trips was usually to do whatever little research projects a teacher had assigned a 3rd or 4th grader, or simply to finish my homework in a quiet environment. However, I had my own agenda. I would wander into the periodicals section and sneak old issues of National Geographic back to my table. I would hide them inside my textbooks or slide them under my worksheets when my mom wasn't looking. I would lose myself in the articles about dead civilizations, reading voraciously about the work being done to excavate their tombs and lost cities. I was captivated by their superstitions, their strange religions, and the mystery of how entire societies could just vanish into the sands of time. So, when my birthday rolled around the following year, and my parents asked me the inevitable question of what I wanted for a present, I didn't hesitate. I proudly named off several books about archaeology that I had seen or heard about. I was expecting glossy pages filled with golden sarcophagi and white marble columns. A few days later, on the morning of my 10th birthday, I was given my present. It was a heavy package wrapped in bright paper. I tore it open to reveal 3 big, thick books. However, they weren't exactly what I had been expecting. In my 10-year-old mind, archaeology was synonymous with King Tut and the Parthenon. I thought I had explicitly asked for books about ancient Greece and Egypt, but instead I received a set of books about ancient societies that lived in North and South America and the Caribbean. At first, I felt a twinge of disappointment, but that quickly faded. This was something new, something I hadn't discovered yet. The books were dense, filled with information about the Maya, the Inca, and various island tribes, detailing the excavations that had occurred for each respective society. Being that I was only about 10 years old at the time, I was at a stage in my development where I was becoming very aware of the female form. To put it bluntly, I was a huge fan of breasts. I would flip through the books looking for pictures that might offer a glimpse of something interesting. In one of the books, specifically the one focused on Caribbean and South American tribes, I found an image that arrested my attention. It was a photograph of a dark figurine that had been carved, perhaps, from some kind of dark volcanic stone. It wasn't shiny like onyx, but it had a deep, matte black finish. I can't remember exactly what the stone was at this point, but the image is burned into my memory. It was a figurine of a pregnant woman with enormous breasts, which is why I initially liked the picture. However, as I looked closer, I realized the statue was broken. It was missing its head. The neck ends in a jagged, rough break that contrasts with the smooth carving of the body. On the page immediately adjacent to the figurine was a black and white photograph of a living pregnant tribeswoman. She was standing in a profile pose that mimicked the statue almost perfectly. The text in the book makes the conjecture that the headless figurine was an ancient religious icon or a fertility idol representing a pregnant tribeswoman, much like the one in the photo. I kept looking back and forth between the two pictures. I looked at the woman, full of life, and then at the dark, cold stone statue with its missing head. The connection the book was drawing began to unsettle me deeply. It wasn't just a statue anymore. It feels like a mutilated body. Eventually, I became so freaked out by the juxtaposition of the images that I couldn't look at them anymore. A creeping sense of dread would wash over me whenever I held that book. During future read-throughs, I would carefully skip those pages entirely, afraid that if I looked at the headless woman again, something bad might happen. As I grew older, entering my teenage years, my intense interest in archaeology is scarce quite a bit. The allure of dusty tombs and broken pots faded, replaced by more active imaginations. My archaeology books, including the one with the disturbing figurine, ended up in a cardboard box and were eventually donated to the local library. I moved on to other interests that were more typical for a boy my age, namely fantasy novels, science fiction movies, and tabletop role-playing games. I forgot about the headless statue and the strange feelings it evoked, burying that memory deep in the back of my mind as I navigated the complexities of high school. Several years down the road, when I was approaching my 16th birthday, my parents announced that they had planned a trip. We were going to a bed and breakfast that was owned by some old friends of my mother. The destination was an old estate located a few hours north, located next to a main road but isolated enough to feel rural. The property belongs to the main house where the bed and breakfast was operated, a separate carriage house that had been converted for storage and staff use, and about 50 yards away, another smaller house where the owners, my mother's friends, actually lived. The estate was situated on an enormous old plot of land that stretched back as far as the eye could see. Despite being relatively close to the highway, the entire property was surrounded by dense, sprawling apple orchards. My parents told me they were taking me up there for my 16th birthday. My immediate internal reaction was sarcasm. I thought, just what every 16-year-old boy wants, a week at a quiet bed and breakfast with his parents. However, they had a bargaining chip. I had just received my driver's license, and the ink was barely dry on the plastic. They told me they would let me drive their car for the entire trip, both up there and back. The prospect of logging that much driving time and being in control of the vehicle was enough to sway me. I acquiesced and agreed to go with them without too much complaining. When we arrived, I had to admit that the place was actually amazing. It wasn't the stuffy, boring house I had imagined. It was enormous and imposing, with architecture that spoke of a different era. The houses on the property were all around 150 years old, built with heavy timber and stone. There was a palpable sense of history that surrounds the area, a weight to the air that you don't feel in modern suburbs. Of course, there were the requisite stories of ghost sightings and local legends, which added a layer of coolness to the atmosphere. The orchards were awesome, stretching out in perfect, endless rows, the trees gnarled and heavy with age. The staff at the bed and breakfast was really cool, which made the stay much more tolerable. Everybody was very laid back, not uptight like hotel staff. One of the cooks was a woman named Serene. She was a thin black woman with a striking presence. She was very pretty, but there was something about her demeanor that was hard to pin down. She seemed perpetually distracted, or perhaps flighty is the better word, as if her mind was always partially somewhere else. She speaks with this really thick, melodic island accent that makes everything she said sound musical. Regardless of her spacing out, she was very entertaining to talk to, and she had an awesome, infectious laugh that would echo through the large kitchen. We would all hang out in the evenings, and I noticed a peculiar habit of hers. When we were sitting on the porch or near the windows at night, she would often turn her eyes toward the dark expanse of the orchard. She would stop talking mid-sentence and kind of get lost in her thoughts, staring into the trees as if she were watching something moving in the dark. We stayed there for a little more than a week, settling into a slow, relaxing rhythm. After the first few days of novelty wore off, I had grown somewhat bored. There is only so much sitting around a teenager can do. I asked my mother's friend, the owner, if it would be okay if I took a stroll through the orchard to kill some time. She smiled and said, "Sure, explore as much as you'd like. It's beautiful out there. But please make sure you get back here before sunset. There are coyotes in the area, and they come out when it gets dark." I thought that was awesome. That warning didn't scare me. It excited me. That childish urge to explore, the one that used to make me dig through library books, had woken up since I was submerged in a place that had some actual history. Something inside of me really wanted to find an old Civil War bullet or an arrowhead or some relics of the past out in the dirt of the orchard. The first day I went out there, it was really uneventful. In fact, the excitement wore off and it grew old quickly. The property was immense, far bigger than it looked from the house. I had explored for about 2 hours, walking down row after row of apple trees, and all I could see was a tree line somewhere in the hazy distance. It feels like a maze of vegetation, and my mom's friend wasn't kidding about the coyotes. As I walked, looking at the ground for artifacts, I saw prints in some of the areas where the soil was softer and muddy. They were canine prints, too big for a fox and too wild for a dog. It added a thrill to the walk, knowing I wasn't the only thing moving through the trees. Deep in the orchard, I found one spot that stood out from the rest. It looked as if a couple of the coyotes, or maybe something larger, had bedded down for the night. There was a swath of terrain in between 2 large, ancient apple trees, where the tall grass had been tamped down flat. It creates a sort of oval clearing. What was strange was that the soil in the exact middle of this matted down area was actually devoid of any grass or vegetation. It was just a patch of bare, hard-packed earth, as if something heavy had sat there for a long time, or as if the ground refused to grow anything in that specific spot. At first, I thought this was strange, and I poked around the dirt with my shoe, but I didn't find anything. My teenage appetite took over when I looked up and saw a giant, perfect apple hanging on a limb right above me. I plucked it, wiped it on my shirt, and ate it while I stood in that strange, silent clearing. On my way back to the house, the sun began to get lower in the sky, casting long, creepy shadows through the tree rows. I got a little lost, momentarily confused by the repetitive nature of the orchard, but I eventually oriented myself. As I walked, I happened to see Serene in the distance. She was walking slowly along the edge of the property, near where the manicured lawn met the wilder grass of the orchard. She saw me and smiled, waving me over. I jogged a bit to catch up with her. As I got closer, I realized she was humming a tune. It was a soft, rhythmic melody sounding like a lullaby, but with a melancholic undertone that felt heavy in the cooling air. I asked her about the song, curious as to what it was. She stopped humming and looked at me with her large, dark eyes. She told me that it was an old island song from her home, a melody that people in the Caribbean sang in order to calm noisy or upset spirits. It was a song for the dead, she explained, to help them find peace. We chatted a bit as we walked toward the house, and the conversation turned to her time at the estate. She told me that she had been working there for about 8 months. She said that the first 2.5 months had been atrocious for her, almost unbearable. When I pressed her on why, asking if the work was too hard, she became a bit distant again, that familiar glazed look returning to her eyes. She said, very seriously, that the spirits of the area were very restless. I asked her how she knew that and why she was so concerned about it. She smiled broadly, a look of secrets kept, and said that all of the women in her family had a deep connection with the spirits. It was a gift, or a curse, passed down through generations. She said that soon after her arrival at the bed and breakfast, she began seeing many of them. And perhaps more disturbingly, they began seeing her. She explained that because she could feel them, they were drawn to her like moths to a flame. They began to take quite an interest in her and would bother her incessantly, particularly during the night when she was trying to sleep. Old men and women, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, that couldn't find their way. They get angry, very angry. They are confused and lost, and they lash out. And this island song quiets them and soothes their anger. Being an inquisitive and somewhat amused teenager who didn't really believe in ghosts, I decided to test her. I looked around the empty field and asked, "Are there any spirits with us right now?" She stopped walking and nodded her head slowly. Her smile somewhat disappeared, replaced by a look of intense focus. "How many?" I inquired, half expecting her to say 1 or 2. She stopped in her tracks completely. She turned to face me, and all remnants of that smile disappeared from her face. She looked dead serious, almost afraid. She said, "Boy, if I were to tell you the answer to that, you would pack your things and go right now." A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. As we started walking again, the silence was heavy between us. Trying to lighten the mood or change the subject, I told her about the area that I had found in the orchard, where the grass was tamped down and the earth was bare. I talked to her about the coyote prints I had seen nearby. She listened intently, and a suspicious look crossed her face. She didn't laugh or brush it off. She looked at me with genuine concern and only said, "I don't think you should go back there, friend. The orchard is big and there are many curious things in it. Some places are best left alone." We got back to the bed and breakfast right as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. The next day, we went into the local town and did a bunch of touristy things that my parents wanted to do. I tagged along, visiting antique shops and looking at historical markers. It was kind of fun, and I enjoyed driving the car around the winding country roads, but I kept thinking about the orchard. In particular, I couldn't get my mind off that one spot with the bare earth and Serene's warning. It felt like a puzzle I needed to solve. We got back to the estate after dark. The air was crisp and cold. Just as my mom's friend had warned us, and just as the prince had promised, we could hear the coyotes howling in the distance, their yips and cries loudly through the trees, sounding lonely and wild, coming from the direction of the deep orchard where I had stood earlier that day. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. That night, the sky opened up. A heavy, relentless rain hammered against the roof of the old house, washing away the dust of the summer and turning the dry earth of the orchard into a thick, clinging mud. I lay in bed, listening to the storm, the sound of water running through the gutters acting like a lullaby. But my mind was still racing with thoughts of the strange clearing I had found. The next morning, the air smelled rich and damp, that heavy scent of wet soil and bruised apples. The sun was trying to peek through the lingering clouds, but the ground was soaked. Despite the mud, my curiosity hadn't been dampened in the slightest. At breakfast, I asked my parents and their friends if it would be all right for me to head out into the orchard again. They were busy chatting over coffee and eggs, happy that I was finding ways to entertain myself without complaining, so they gave me the green light without much hesitation. I decided to wait until the afternoon to head out, giving the soil a chance to dry out just a little bit so I wouldn't be slipping and sliding with every step. I went up to my room to prepare. I grabbed my backpack and, feeling like a rebellious teenager, I managed to sneak a couple of beers from the fridge when no one was looking, burying them deep in the bag under a sweatshirt. I also packed a sandwich I had made, acting like I was going on a major expedition. I was planning on exploring as much of the property as I could, pushing further than I had the day before. I wanted to see where the apple trees ended and the rest of the world began. I stepped off the porch and made my way into the orchard. The ground was soft and spongy, squelching slightly under my boots. I started making my way through the trees, roughly following the path that I had taken previously, though everything looked a little different in the damp light. I walked for a couple of hours in one steady direction, letting the rhythm of the walking clear my head. The rows of trees seemed endless, a repetitive pattern of bark and leaves, until finally the landscape changed. I reached some sort of property line. It was marked by an old, crumbling stone wall, the type you see in Civil War movies or history books. It was a low barrier of stacked gray stones, covered in moss and lichen, marking the end of the cultivated orchard. About 100 feet beyond the wall, a thick, dense forest began, looking wild and untamed compared to the orderly rows of apple trees. I was pretty excited to have found a landmark. I followed the wall for quite some time, walking along the perimeter. I stopped occasionally to dig through piles of crumbled stone where the wall had collapsed, hoping to find a relic. I was still hunting for that elusive Civil War bullet or a button from a soldier's uniform. I didn't find any metal, but my luck wasn't entirely out. I managed to find some arrowheads half buried in the dirt near the base of the wall. They were chipped flint, sharp and cool too. The touch. I felt a rush of triumph as I stashed them in my bag, feeling like a real archaeologist. After a while, I decided to take a break. I stopped at a spot where the wall was still sturdy enough to sit on. I climbed up, letting my legs dangle, and pulled out my sandwich and one of the stolen beers. I sat there in the quiet of the afternoon, eating and drinking, feeling like the king of my own little kingdom. I was just about to finish up when the silence was broken. I heard a loud crashing sound coming from the woods beyond the clearing. It sounded like heavy branches breaking and underbrush being trampled. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I stuffed the last bite of the sandwich into my mouth, chugged the rest of the warm beer, and shoved the trash back into my bag. The minute I finished packing up, I glanced over toward the forest line. 3 coyotes emerged from the shadows of the trees. They were larger than I expected, their coats matted and damp from the rain. I instinctively ducked down behind the stone wall, pressing my back against the cold rocks, hoping that they hadn't seen me. My breathing was shallow and fast. I knew they were just wild animals, but being alone with them out here felt dangerous. I waited for a moment, listening to the soft pad of their paws on the wet leaves. I slowly poked my head up over the top of the wall to peek. Sure enough, they hadn't noticed me. They started moving languidly away from my position, traveling along the line of the wall, sniffing at the ground. I watched them for a while, fascinated. Occasionally, they would stop when they heard a twig snap or a bird call, their ears swiveling like radar dishes. Every time they stopped, I would duck back down, playing a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek. I followed them from my side of the wall, crouching low, but soon enough, the wall actually ended. The stones trailed off into a pile of rubble, and I was suddenly exposed in the open field. The minute I had nothing to hide behind, their instincts kicked in. They took notice of me instantly. All 3 of them, in perfect unison, stopped moving. They turned their heads and looked right at me. It wasn't the skittish look of a prey animal. It was a calculated, intelligent stare. We stared at each other for a few seconds, a silent standoff in the damp air. Then, as if deciding I wasn't a threat or a meal, they turned back around and went about their business, trotting away into the tall grass. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding and started heading back into the orchard. I wanted to get back to the house before it started getting dark. On my way back through the trees, I got a little lost again. The uniformity of the orchard was disorienting, and without the sun to guide me clearly, I wandered around in circles for a bit. To distract myself, I went back to scanning the ground, hoping to find old cans or bottles, anything to make my explorations feel a bit more fruitful. Eventually, through sheer luck, or perhaps something else, I came across the area that I had noticed a few days ago. It was the same clearing between the trees. The vegetation was still somewhat tamped down, creating that oval shape, and the spot in the middle was still bare earth. However, looking at it now with fresh eyes, something didn't look right. I approached the spot slowly and looked at the ground. The way that the grass had been pressed down looked strange. It wasn't evenly flattened, the way it would be if a coyote or a deer had laid upon it to sleep. It was really uneven in parts, mashed into the mud. It almost looked as if boots or heavy feet had stomped it down repeatedly, dancing or pacing in a circle. Then something caught my eye. In the center of the clearing, where there was no growth, the heavy rain had washed away the top layer of loose dirt. There was something dark and smooth protruding from the mud. It had a slight shine to it, contrasting with the dull brown of the earth. I thought I had hit the jackpot. My mind immediately went to Civil War relics, maybe part of an old rifle stock or a cannonball or something equally great. I knelt down in the mud, not caring about my jeans, and grabbed a hold of whatever this thing was. I gave it a tug. The ground, still damp and yielding from the storm, gave way easily. I pulled it free with a sucking sound. It was covered in mud, a lump of wet clay in my hands. I used my thumbs to clear the damp earth from it, revealing the object underneath. It wasn't metal, it was stone, dark and heavy. As I wiped it clean, the shape became clear. It was a figurine of some sort. It was shaped oddly, and from what I could tell, it looked like a human figure. It was a depiction of a fat man or woman, with exaggerated features and a rounded belly. But the most striking thing about it was the top. It was broken. It was missing its head. A cold chill that had nothing to do with the damp air washed over me. I suddenly remembered the books I had received for my 10th birthday. I remembered the glossy pages about ancient tribes in the Caribbean and South America. I remembered the photo of the headless figurine, the fertility idol that had terrified me so much as a child. This was almost identical. It felt heavy in my hand, heavier than a stone of that size should be. I also remembered what Serene had told me about the angry spirits, the old men and women who couldn't find their way. I started to get a little freaked out. The silence of the orchard suddenly felt oppressive. I tossed the figure into my backpack, zipping it shut quickly as if to trap the bad vibes inside, and started moving. I walked fast, wanting to put distance between myself and that stomped-down circle. I tried to hum the tune that Serene had taught me 2 days prior, the lullaby to soothe the spirits, but my mind was blank. I couldn't remember the melody properly. It came out as a nervous, disjointed whistle. Then I heard something in the orchard. It wasn't the wind. It sounded as if somebody was walking ever so lightly upon the ground behind me. Crunch, step, crunch. I stopped walking to listen. The sound stopped. I started walking again. Crunch, step, crunch. It started again. It would stop when I stopped. It would start when I started. The hair on my arms stood up. I was being stalked. At one point, when I calculated I was about 10 minutes away from the bed and breakfast, I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped abruptly, dropped to the ground, and looked back through the tunnel of trees, trying to see under the canopy. In the distance, about 25 yards away, I saw them. The 3 coyotes. They were watching me intently. They had lowered their heads, their bodies low to the ground in a predatory crouch. They weren't just wandering anymore. They were hunting, or at least escorting me. When I stood up and began walking again, they started tracking me again, matching my movements perfectly. I decided to test them. I walked very, very slowly. They walked very, very slowly, lifting their paws with exaggerated care. I picked up my pace, almost jogging. They picked up their pace, trotting silently to keep the distance constant. Panic was starting to set in. I was just a kid with a bag of arrowheads and a stolen beer, being trailed by a pack of wild animals. And then, cutting through the fear, I heard humming. It was a deep, melodic sound, drifting through the trees. The coyotes picked up their ears, swiveling them toward the noise. I looked ahead and saw Serene in the distance, walking along the edge of the property, coming my way. She was wearing a long shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Relieved, I almost ran toward her. The coyotes still followed, undeterred by her presence. She saw me coming toward her and smiled, a warm, knowing expression on her face. I pointed frantically back at the coyotes behind me. She paused, looked at them, and then laughed. It was a light, airy laugh. "It's okay, boy," she said, her accent thick and comforting. "They're just curious about you is all." I sighed, the tension leaving my shoulders. I approached her and she turned to walk with me back toward the house. The coyotes stopped at a certain distance, sitting down to watch us go. "I found the wall today," I told her, eager to share my adventure now that I felt safe. "Did you now?" She looked disinterested, looking up at the sky. "Did you go over it? Into the forest?" she asked. "No," I said, "but that's where I first saw the coyotes." "And you followed them, didn't you?" She smiled, a sly look in her eyes. "Yeah," I admitted. "How did you know?" "They told me," she said simply. "They told me that you followed them because you were curious like their brother Wolf. And then they were curious about you, so they started following. They also smelled your sandwich. They wouldn't hurt you, though." I looked at her, wondering if she was joking, but her face was serene. We walked for a few more minutes, the presence of the coyotes still lingering behind us in the shadows. I was beginning to suspect that she had been feeding them over the tenure of her employment at the B&B, which would explain why they were so comfortable around people. "Oh," I said, remembering the weight in my backpack. I stopped and swung the bag off my shoulder. I found this in the orchard. I guess it had been buried, but the rain unearthed it some. It was at the center of that area that I found the other day. You know, where the grass was pressed down? I dug through the bag, past the empty beer can and the arrowheads, until my fingers closed around the cold stone. Although I don't think it was the coyotes anymore, I continued, pulling it out. It looked more like some other animal, or maybe people tamped the grass down. I grabbed the figure and brought it forth from my bag, holding it out to her in the dying light of the afternoon. The mud had dried slightly, making the headless shape even more distinct. She took one look at the figurine, and her face went completely white. She blanched, her eyes going wide. Shakily, she reached out and pulled the figurine from my hands, her fingers trembling. "What have you done, boy?" she whispered, her voice trembling. My heart sank. I thought she would have been as excited as I was, that she would find it interesting or historical. Instead, she looked terrified. She clenched the figure in her hand so tight that her knuckles turned ash gray, and her whole body shook with a sudden violent anger. Her eyes widened until I could see the whites all around her irises, and she screamed at me in a hideous, almost guttural tone of voice that didn't sound like her at all. "What have you done?" Story 7. I stood there stammering, trying to find a way to justify what I had done, but my words felt hollow in the heavy air of the orchard. I tried to explain to her that I had seen something like it in an old book of mine once, that I thought it was just an interesting artifact and I didn't mean any harm. I wanted to tell her I didn't know what it really was, but before I could get a coherent sentence out, she turned and bolted. She didn't walk. She ran frantically back into the depths of the orchard, her shawl flapping behind her like broken wings. I looked over and saw the coyotes, who had been watching us with that unnerving intelligence, turn their heads to watch her run. Then, without a sound, I took off after her. My boots slipped in the mud, but I pushed myself, shouting her name into the darkening trees. I shouted that I was sorry, my voice cracking with a mix of puberty and panic, but she didn't slow down. She made it back to the clearing with the tamped-down grass before I did. By the time I crashed through the final row of trees, gasping for breath, she was already on the ground. She had dropped to her knees in the mud, ignoring the stains on her dress, and was clawing at the earth with her bare hands. She was crying a high-pitched, desperate sound while trying to hum that soothing island tune between sobs. The coyotes had stopped at the edge of the clearing, sitting on their haunches like silent sentinels watching the ritual unfold. I didn't hesitate. I dropped to my knees beside her, the cold mud soaking instantly into my jeans, and started digging as well. We clawed at the wet soil together, my fingernails tearing against roots and stones until we had reopened the small pit I had created earlier. It was a frantic, messy effort, fueled by her terror which had somehow transferred to me. When the hole was deep enough, I grabbed the stone figurine from where I had dropped it. My hands were shaking. I wanted to fix this. I placed the idol carefully into the hole, setting it upright, just as a statue should stand. I began to push the earth back on top of it, thinking that was what she wanted, but Serene shrieked, a sound of pure horror. "No, no, no!" she cried out, reaching into the hole and grabbing my wrist to stop me. She pulled the figure back up, her hands trembling violently. She turned the heavy stone object over in her hands and shoved it back into the ground head first, so it was upside down. "Like that," she muttered, her voice thick with tears. "It must be like that." She fell back onto her rear, exhausted, and covered her face with her hands, rocking back and forth while she hummed and cried. I didn't ask questions. I quickly covered the inverted figurine with the loose mud, packing it down tight with my palms until the ground was flat again. When I was done, I looked around the clearing. The coyotes were nowhere to be seen. They had vanished as silently as they had arrived, leaving us alone in the twilight. Serene was still crying, her body shaking with every sob, that island tune broken and dissonant coming from her lips. I sat there in the mud next to her, searching my mind for the right words of apology, for something that could fix the fear I saw in her eyes, but there were none. I was just a stupid kid who had touched something he shouldn't have. After a moment, she scooted over closer to me. She wrapped her thin arms around me, seeking comfort as much as giving it. I didn't pull away. I leaned into her and began humming the tune with her, a low rumble in my chest, trying to harmonize with her shaky soprano. Her tears became fierce then, a release of pent-up dread, and her sobs forced her to stop humming entirely. I stopped as well, and we sat in the silence of the orchard, the wind rustling the apple leaves above us. That is when we heard it. It didn't start with a crash. It started as a sharp, high-pitched keen, sounding far away, coming from the direction of the main road that bordered the estate. It was a mechanical scream, the sound of rubber tires wrestling violently with pavement, trying desperately to keep a hold on the road at high speed. It lasted for a terrifying second, stretching out in the quiet night. And then there was a sudden, sickening silence. It was the sound of friction failing, of the tires losing their battle. That split second of silence was heavier than the scream, and then it was followed by a heart-wrenching, solid crash. It wasn't the sound of metal scraping along a guardrail, or the shattering of glass skittering across the asphalt like insects. It was a dull, wet, vomit-inducing crunch. It was the sound of a heavy object coming to a sudden, violent stop against something that would not move. Serene stopped crying instantly. She went perfectly silent, her head snapping up toward the road. She stood up, her movements jerky and stiff, and began to run back toward the bed and breakfast without saying a word to me. I scrambled to my feet and followed her, my heart hammering against my ribs. We ran through the rows of trees, the branches whipping at our faces, ignoring the darkness. By the time we reached the edge of the orchard, close enough to see the manicured lawn of the main house, we could see that the peace of the evening had been shattered. The guests at the bed and breakfast, including my parents and their friends, were standing in confused groups on the grounds, looking toward the road. In the distance, we could hear the wail of sirens approaching, and rising above the tree line across the street, we saw a plume of black smoke. The car had, somehow, left the road at high speed. It had jumped the ditch and slammed head-on into a massive, ancient oak tree that stood directly across the street from the bed and breakfast's driveway. The impact was catastrophic. Serene didn't go to the guests or the owners. She immediately went to a group of the staff who had gathered near the kitchen entrance. She threw herself into the arms of the large white cook, the man who had been kind to me earlier in the week. He held her tight as she wept, her legs giving out, her grief renewed and amplified. I found my parents near the front porch, just as the ambulances and police cruisers shrieked into view, their red and blue lights painting the house in chaotic flashes. The fire truck actually pulled right into the driveway of the bed and breakfast to turn around. The atmosphere was thick with anxiety. Everybody was asking questions, anxious to know if the driver was okay, if there had been passengers, and if anyone had survived. My parents, trying to protect me, pulled me close. My mother's friends, the owners of the estate, went down the driveway to speak with several of the firemen and EMTs who were setting up a perimeter. They spoke in hushed, serious tones for a few minutes. When they returned to the group, their faces were pale and grim. They urged everybody to return inside immediately. They didn't give details, only saying that the EMTs had informed them that the scene was rather gruesome, and that none of us should be around to witness them extract the body from the wreckage. They herded us into the main house like sheep, trying to shield us from the Reality across the street. I didn't see Karine again that night. She had disappeared into the staff quarters. The EMTs and the firefighters worked for several hours under the glare of floodlights. I couldn't sleep, and I couldn't sit still. I found myself in the small bar area of the house, which had a window facing the road. I watched from the darkened room as they worked. I saw them use the jaws of life, saw the sparks fly. Finally, I watched as they moved a large black body bag onto a gurney. They wheeled it from the crash site to the waiting ambulance. The strobe lights of the emergency vehicles cast long, dancing shadows, but I could see the bag clearly. It had a very distinct profile. Even under the heavy material, the shape was undeniable. It was uneven, bulky in the middle, and oddly flat at the top. I walked back to where my parents were sitting. I told them my story about the coyotes, leaving out the part about the figurine, and confessed to taking the beers. They were so shaken by the accident outside that they barely registered my transgression. They let me off the hook completely. In fact, my dad let me have the last beer out of my pack, thinking that I was just a frightened teenager needing to calm his nerves after seeing the commotion. When the ambulances finally began to leave, driving slowly and without lights or sirens, a sign that there was no rush, no life to save, my parents' friends went outside again to talk to the few remaining firemen who were cleaning up the debris. As I stood by the window watching the last of the flashing lights fade, the kitchen door opened. The large white man, the cook, entered the bar. He looked exhausted, his face drawn and sad. He saw me standing there and approached me slowly. He sighed, a heavy, rattling sound in his chest. "Terrible thing, isn't it?" he asked, looking out the window at the scarred tree across the road. I looked up at him, gripping my warm beer can. "Yeah," I said softly. "I wonder what happened." He grimaced, a flicker of pain crossing his face, and looked down at me. "There are many bad things in the orchard," he said, his voice low. He nodded at me, a gesture that felt like an accusation and a lesson wrapped in one. "You understand that Serene's upset, right? You know why?" I shook my head, feigning ignorance, though a pit was opening in my stomach. "The spirits will be very angry now," he said. "Very angry." I swallowed hard and nodded. "Tell her I'm sorry?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He considered it for a moment, looking at me with a mix of pity and sternness. Before turning to leave back toward the kitchen, he replied, "The orchard is big and there are many curious things in it, but curious boys don't belong there." He walked out of the room, leaving me alone in the dim light. Just then, the front door opened and my mom's friends returned from the driveway. They walked into the common area where my parents were waiting. They looked shaken to their core. "That's a horrible thing to hear," Scott, the husband, said, running a hand through his hair. "Tragic," his wife replied, her voice trembling. My parents stared at them for a moment, waiting for the news. The fire truck had finally left, leaving the road dark and empty. "What happened?" my dad asked, breaking the silence. I turned from the window, looking at the adults. The image of the headless stone idol and the shape of the body bag merged in my mind with a terrifying clarity. I knew the answer before they spoke. "A pregnant woman was beheaded and died in the crash," I said from the window. My voice sounded strange, detached, as if someone else were speaking through me. The room went dead silent. They all turned to look at me, their eyes wide with shock and confusion. My mother's friend took a step toward me, her face pale. "How did you know?" she asked. There is a specific kind of freedom that comes with getting your very first apartment, a feeling of independence that is almost intoxicating. I remember the day I signed the lease, my hand shaking slightly with a mix of nerves and excitement. I was young, eager to start my own life, and I felt like I had struck absolute gold with the location I found. It wasn't just some sterile cookie-cutter box in a modern complex. It was something with character, something with history. The apartment was located in a massive old antebellum house that had been converted and split into 4 separate units. It was a stunning piece of architecture, the kind you see in movies about the Deep South, with a sprawling wraparound porch, towering white columns, and ancient oak trees in the yard that draped moss over the roof like a protective blanket. The rent was surprisingly affordable for how much space I was getting, and I remember thinking that I was the luckiest person in the world to snag it. The move-in process was a blur of cardboard boxes, pizza, and the smell of old wood and lemon polish. The interior of the apartment was beautiful in that slightly worn, historic way. The ceilings were 12 feet high, the crown molding was thick and intricate, and the hardwood floors creaked with every step, telling the stories of the dozens of families who had walked there before me. I loved the quirks of the place. I loved the way the windows stuck a little when you tried to open them, and how the air always smelled faintly of dust and old books. For the first few weeks, I was in heaven. I spent my time decorating, arranging my furniture just so, and inviting friends over to show off my new adult living space. It felt like the start of a perfect chapter in my life. I ignored the slight draft in the hallway and the way the shadows seemed to stretch a little too long in the evenings. I was just happy to be there. However, the honeymoon phase didn't last very long. The atmosphere of the apartment began to shift, slowly at first, and then with an intensity that I couldn't ignore. It started in the bathroom. The bathroom was tucked away at the back of the unit, a small windowless room with old fixtures that had likely been there since the mid-century renovations. It had a clawfoot tub that had been retrofitted with a shower ring and a curtain. The first time it happened, I brushed it off as new house jitters. I was taking a shower, the hot water running over me, steam filling the small space, when I suddenly felt a cold prickle on the back of my neck. It was that unmistakable primal sensation of being watched. I froze, the soap stinging my eyes, and whipped around, ripping the shower curtain back. Of course, the bathroom was empty. The door was locked. I laughed at myself, thinking I was watching too many horror movies, and finished my shower. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, every time I stepped into that bathroom, the anxiety would spike. It became a ritual of fear. I would lock the door, check behind the curtain before I got in, and try to shower as quickly as possible. The feeling was overwhelming. It wasn't just a vague sense of unease. It felt like there were eyes boring into me from the corner of the room, right near the ceiling. It felt heavy and oppressive, like someone was standing right on the other side of the thin plastic curtain, holding their breath, just waiting for me to close my eyes. I started to dread the basic act of getting clean. I would stand there under the spray, my heart hammering against my ribs, unable to relax for even a second. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was the acoustics of the old house, or the way the ventilation fan rattled, but deep down, I knew it was something else. Then the dreams started. If the shower was bad, the nights became a nightmare. It began innocently enough, which is almost worse when I look back on it. I would fall asleep in my bedroom, which was down the hall from the bathroom, and I would find myself in a dreamscape that looked exactly like my apartment, but slightly different. The lighting was dimmer, the furniture was older. In these dreams, I would see an old lady. She was small and frail, with wispy white hair and a face that looked soft and grandmotherly. She was always wearing the same thing, a long, flowing pink nightgown with lace around the collar. It looked like something from the 1950s, elegant but worn. In the beginning, she just looked sweet. She would stand at the end of the hallway or in the corner of my bedroom, just watching me with a gentle expression. She would beckon to me with a bony hand, waving me over. I would hear her voice in my head, soft and raspy, saying, "You should come with me." She never said where. She never explained what she wanted. She just wanted me to follow her. In the dream, I would feel a strange compulsion to go to her, a mixture of curiosity and pity. I would take a step toward her, and then I would wake up, usually sweating and tangled in my sheets, with the echo of her voice still ringing in my ears. I tried to dismiss it as stress. I figured the old house was just seeping into my subconscious. I told myself it was just a recurring dream about a generic old lady. But as the weeks went on, the dreams began to change. The sweetness evaporated, replaced by something dark and menacing. The transition was terrifying. I would go to sleep, dreading what I might see. The old lady in the pink nightgown was still there, but she wasn't the kindly grandmother figure anymore. She began to look sickly. In the dreams, the lighting would be greenish and sickly, casting long, warped shadows on the walls. She would appear closer to my bed now, looming over me. Her once soft face was now twisted and wrong. Her skin looked gray and papery, pulled too tight over her skull. The most horrifying part was her eyes. Where there used to be gentle, cloudy eyes, there were now just empty black sockets. It was like looking into a void. I could see the darkness swirling inside her skull. Her hair, which used to be wispy and white, was now greasy and stringy, falling out in clumps, revealing patches of scabbed scalp underneath. It looked wet, like she had been submerged in water or sweat for days. Her mouth was the worst of all. It was twisted open in a permanent silent scream of torment. Her jaw hung unnaturally low, as if it was broken or unhinged. She didn't speak to me anymore. She didn't ask me to come with her. Instead, she would lunge at me. I would be paralyzed in the dream, unable to move my arms or legs, watching helplessly as this rotting figure in a pink nightgown flew toward me. She would frantically claw at the air, her fingers hooked like talons, trying to grab my throat or my face. I could hear the sound of her rasping breath, a wet, rattling sound that filled the room. I would try to scream, but no sound would come out. I would feel the wind of her movement as she swiped at me, inches from my face, before I would finally jolt awake, my heart racing so fast I thought I was having a cardiac event. The terror lingered long after I woke up. I would turn on every light in the apartment and sit in the living room, afraid to close my eyes again, afraid that she was waiting for me back in the dream world. The longer I lived there, the more aggressive the presence became. It wasn't just contained to the nightmares anymore. It bled into my waking life, specifically back in that bathroom. The feeling of being watched increased dramatically. It went from a creepy feeling to a physical sensation of danger. The air in the bathroom would turn freezing cold, even when I had the hot water running full blast. I would see shadows darting in my peripheral vision, moving behind the shower curtain or reflecting in the mirror. I became convinced that if I looked into the mirror too long, I would see her standing behind me, her empty sockets staring into mine. By the time I was nearing the end of my lease, I was a nervous wreck. The bathroom had become a place of pure terror for me. It sounds silly to say it out loud, but I developed a genuine phobia of closing my eyes in the shower. I was terrified that if I blinked for too long, or if I closed my eyes to rinse the shampoo out of my hair, I would open them and she would be there. I had this overwhelming, irrational feeling that I was going to die in there. I felt like if I let my guard down, if I stopped watching the room for even a second, she would get me. I felt like I would lose my soul or be dragged away to wherever she wanted to take me in those early dreams. I started washing my hair with my eyes wide open, letting the soap sting and burn, just so I wouldn't have to embrace the darkness. My showers became 30-second panic attacks. I would jump out, towel off frantically, and run out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind me. I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. The cheap rent and the beautiful architecture weren't worth my sanity. I didn't renew the lease. I packed up my boxes with a sense of urgency that I hadn't felt when moving in. I wanted out. I wanted to be somewhere modern, somewhere without history, somewhere that didn't smell like old dust and fear. The day I moved the last box out, I felt a physical weight lift off my shoulders. I drove away from that antebellum house without looking back, feeling like I had escaped a trap. A few months after moving out, I settled into a new place and started to feel like myself again. The nightmares stopped, and I could finally take a shower without keeping a weapon within reach. One afternoon, I was catching up with a friend of mine who had recently moved into the neighborhood where my old apartment was. He had actually rented a house directly across the street from that old antebellum mansion. We were having coffee, just chatting about life, and the topic of my old apartment came up. I was feeling brave enough to talk about it, trying to laugh it off as me just being paranoid and stressed at the time. I told him about the creeping feelings, the shower phobia, and the crazy dreams about the lady in the pink nightgown. I expected him to laugh and tell me I had an overactive imagination. Instead, his face went completely pale. He put his coffee cup down and looked at me with a serious expression. He told me that he had another friend, a guy I didn't know, who used to live in that same building several years ago. Specifically, this guy had lived in the unit directly above mine. My friend told me that the tenants in the building all knew the history of the place, a history that the landlord had conveniently left out when I signed the lease. Apparently, my specific apartment, Unit 4, was infamous. Years ago, an elderly woman had lived there alone. She was known for being a bit of a recluse, rarely leaving the apartment. She had died in there. It wasn't a peaceful death in her sleep. She had suffered a medical episode, a stroke, or a heart attack, and had collapsed in the bathroom. Because she lived alone and had no family checking on her, she wasn't found for weeks. She had died alone, confused and in pain, likely wearing her nightclothes. My blood ran cold. The bathroom, the place where the feeling was the strongest. The place where I felt like I was being watched by eyes that weren't there. My friend continued telling me that since her death, nobody else had wanted to live in that unit for more than a couple of months at a time. It had a revolving door of tenants. People would move in, enticed by the low rent and the cool architecture, and then they would break their lease and leave in the middle of the night, without explanation. I was one of the longest-lasting tenants, apparently. He told me that the friend who lived upstairs used to hear things coming from my apartment when it was empty. Walking, pacing, and sometimes the sound of a woman crying or screaming. I sat there in the coffee shop, feeling sick to my stomach. The lady in the pink nightgown wasn't a figment of my imagination. She was the previous tenant. The frail, sweet version of her was how she wanted to be seen, or maybe how she was before the end. The terrifying, rotting version with the screaming mouth. That was the reality of her death. That was the trauma of dying alone on the bathroom floor, waiting for help that never came. The invitation to go with her took on a much darker meaning. She was lonely, trapped in that apartment, and she wanted company. The story didn't end there, though. A few weeks after that conversation with my friend, I got a text from him. He sent me a link to a news article. I clicked it and saw a picture of the old antebellum house. It was engulfed in flames. The building had recently burned down to the ground. Firefighters had battled the blaze for hours, but the old, dry wood of the structure went up like kindling. The article stated that the fire investigators had traced the source of the blaze. It hadn't started in the attic or the basement. The fire had started in my old apartment. Specifically, they believed it originated in the back of the unit, near the bathroom. They never determined the official cause. There was no electrical fault found, no candles left burning, no gas leak. It just ignited. When I saw the photo of the flames tearing through the roof, I didn't feel sad about the loss of the historic building. I felt a cold chill ripple through my entire body. I thought about the rage I had sensed in those final dreams, the clawing hands, the tormented scream. I thought about the feeling of impending doom I had in the shower. Part of me wonders if she finally found a way to release all that anger, or if she was just trying to destroy the cage she was trapped in. It still creeps me out to this day, knowing that I slept in her room, showered where she died, and that I was the last person to live there before she burned it all down. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments, and in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.